So when music educators are knowingly utilizing harmful and problematic repertoire, fully knowing that the piece of repertoire is something that we don't want to be teaching, how do you respond to that teacher without shutting them down? In this session, I'm going to have an honest conversation, and I invite you to interact as well, whether you're with me live or if you are watching the replay. But let's have an honest conversation about the role that repertoire choices have in culturally responsive music education, as well as how do we support teachers who are knowingly utilizing harmful repertoire choices. How do we work with them, as well as understand what's underneath what is motivating them to continue to make choices that we know are not the best for our kids. Welcome everyone who's joining me, whether you're live or if you're coming on to the replay. But make sure and let me know if you're watching the replay. Give me a hashtag replay in the comments so I know that you are watching. If this is your first time being with me, my name is Ashley Cuthbertson. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm based here in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, and I am the founder and CEO of A. Cuthbertson Consulting. We're a pre-K through, well, we support pre-K through 12 music educators by partnering with schools, districts, and organizations to help them to be more culturally responsive and relevant in their instructional choices, as well as making sure that their instruction is meeting the diverse and ever-evolving needs of today's learners so that all kids, regardless of their background, regardless of their skills, regardless of their ability, that all kids have equitable access to high quality music education that they all deserve. And so I didn't start off as the founder and CEO of my company. I've been full time in my company for the past year, but I've been supporting music educators for 8, I guess 9 almost years through designing and facilitating professional development, mentoring, and instructional coaching. But I started off as a pre-K through 12 music educator. Hey, here in the DC and Northern Virginia area for 12 years. And then I also was an adjunct professor for 6 years as well. I often present at conferences. I also facilitate PDs, for school districts and organizations. I've done I actually was just counting. So it's actually just over 100 PD sessions. Last week, if you were with me for the Lunch and Learn session, I think I was like, I'm not sure how many it is. I just counted up between all of the partnerships that I've had in the last 8 years, plus all of the sessions I've now run on my own, which in the last year alone, it was a lot of PD sessions that I did throughout my own direct-to-teacher program. So it's a little over 100 PD sessions. And I've been so fortunate to work with really dedicated school principals, fine arts supervisors, music teachers all throughout the US as well as internationally. I've had quite a few wonderful Canadian teachers. So, hey, my Canadian friends. I'm also really fortunate that 95% of my teachers that I work with would highly recommend my services to other folks. So, I'm really privileged to do the work that I feel really called to do. That was much harder to do when I was a full-time teacher in the classroom, trying to balance all of the different things. And I feel really fortunate to be able to do what I love, which is advocate for high quality music education for all kids, but even more so to make sure that music teachers have the support that they need to be able to best support their kids. I've said it before and I'll keep saying it again. Music teachers are the hardest working folks. We're often the ones who are coming in hours early, staying hours late. All day we're working with kids. We go on festival trips with kids. We work on concerts in the evenings and on the weekends, and we're preparing for concerts by looking for a repertoire and going to, we're doing the most. And often we receive the least amount of support. We often don't get relevant PD that is content specific for what we're doing to really move us along in our journey. So that is what I do. That is what I experienced myself when I was a pre-K through 12 music educator, just a frustration of like, why do I have to run myself ragged to find high quality PD? And so I decided I would solve that problem at a larger scale. And so that is a little bit what we do. And so just checking my notes for what I wanted to say so I don't ramble on. Yeah, so I wanted to come on and do another lunch and learn session. I came on last week to talk about how do we navigate the pushback that's going to be inevitable as you're supporting your music educators, either in your school or in your district, to be able to focus on culturally responsive teaching practices. And last weekend, I do a lot of conference presenting. And so this month, I've been actually at 3 conferences. One, I was in Syracuse, New York, which was really wonderful to connect with the folks up there at their Equity Summit. And then I've done 2 virtual summits this month as well. And so this weekend, I did the most recent one And I'll be in Pittsburgh next week for a conference, as well as in Kentucky to facilitate PD. So this has been a kind of the summer is like lower key. I feel like when I was, well, actually not lower key when I was a teacher. When I was a teacher, I was teaching all summer. But for some folks, the summer is lower key. But for me, this is like busy season, right? Of lots of conferences continuing to happen, as well as going and facilitating, people's back to school PD. But I'm getting off track. So I wanted to come on and have this conversation because this past weekend, I was presenting at a virtual conference for music educators. This one, I work with pre-K through 12, but this one just happened to focus on elementary teachers. And so it was a room of elementary teachers that I was speaking to. I did my signature conference talk, which is More Than Diverse Repertoire, Culturally Responsive Music Education, because if you've been with me for any length of time, actually, I think it's been a while since I've put up a reminder, so maybe I'll post it. Simply diversifying repertoire is not culturally responsive, even though many music educators, when we look around to see like what are examples of culturally responsive teaching in our content, that's what it looks like, but that's actually not what it is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I did my signature talk, and then I came back on a little bit later in the day. All the presenters and the participants, it was like a Q&A panel kind of thing. And so different teachers were asking questions, and it was a US-based summit. So all the teachers were US music teachers, and they're asking different questions. Presenters are kind of hopping in, and it was nice. It was a conversation that we all were having together. It was nice to hear the expertise of the other presenters, but also just to hear what's going on with music teachers across the country. As I've worked with teachers this last year full time in my company, literally from coast to coast and everywhere in between, it's always really important to me to keep my finger on the pulse of like what's actually happening in our music programs. And so I'm always really interested to hear like what's going on in teachers' classrooms. And so one of the participants asked a question, and they prefaced it in a way that I've heard before, maybe you've heard too, but they prefaced it with, I'm just going to ask this question. Like, I'm just going to ask it. And so immediately I'm like, ooh, what are they going to ask? And in my session, I share several stories about my journey in the classroom and how I came to my framework for culturally responsive music education, which is the blueprint for how do you move music teachers from the more traditional kind of musical practices to this rich, robust, multifaceted approach where we're teaching both to, but also through the cultural frames of reference of our students and utilizing music as a vehicle. I created this framework from my own time, from the time I worked with teachers when I was still teaching and as an adjunct professor, and as I was working with different folks. And so I tell the story of like, how did I even come across this? Because the reality is the reason why I can speak with the authority that I do is because I have made like all of the mistakes. I've made all the mistakes. I've done all the things, but I learn from them. And because I have always been committed to high quality music education for my students, I learned from the mistakes that I made, and I didn't let them hold me back or hold me down. I always took them as lessons to be able to go on. And so my framework, I think it helps to share some of those stories so that people know that like I'm not just some person talking, but like I really do. I know what I'm talking about because I've gone through the fire myself. And so one of the stories that I share in that talk is how I became, I don't want to say recommitted, but how it became really real for me, the harm that can happen from just not knowing the background of your pieces that you're teaching to your kids. And so I share the story of when I discovered the real version of Shortening Bread as I was flipping through this old book and getting excited to find, original source material, and then being horrified to discover how anti-Black and racist the song is. And as a Black woman and as a teacher who had taught that song to probably hundreds of kids over the time before I discovered that, it was horrifying and harmful to like my own soul that I was passing on this hateful rhetoric. And of course, the version of the Shortening Bread that I was teaching was not the original lyrics, of course, but that doesn't matter, right? The spirit of the song was rooted in anti-Blackness, and that was harmful for me to internalize as I processed my own feelings about that. And it led me to be better about the repertoire choices that I made. And so the teacher that asked the question, she prefaced it with, I'm just going to ask this question because I feel like nobody else is saying it. It was because I had presented that like a couple hours before in the summit during my session. And so the teacher had been out of the classroom, I guess, for a period of time. They're coming back into the classroom, and during their time out of the classroom, they were not necessarily a part of the many conversations that have been happening online, offline, at conferences. These last like 5 years, I would say, the conversation has really been brought to the forefront as far as the repertoire choices that we make in our classroom and the traditional repertoire choices that we continue to make, because in the name of tradition, we want to pass on these things because they're standard and we have these memories attached to them. But in reality, they're very harmful for a variety of ways. They may be racist, they may be misogynistic, they may be sexist, they may be transphobic or ableist. Like all these very harmful things are stereotypes being propagated, right? And so I would say the last 5 or so years, the conversation has really been brought to the forefront. But if you have not been engaging in that conversation as much, it may feel to you like a very new thing. And I think that maybe was what this teacher was experiencing, was just, being out of the classroom for a little bit and then coming back and like, whoa, this whole new thing that was not a big conversation before is now a big conversation. And so the teacher asked, and I think they said that they were in Texas. The teacher asked an honest question of like, I don't fully understand why I should be removing songs that I have taught for many years when I don't teach the harmful version, or if I don't share the whole history, right? Like, is it harmful for me to still teach the song? Essentially is what the teacher was asking. If I don't teach the whole history, the teacher was saying, like, I don't fully understand like why that is problematic. And then the teacher also, I believe, mentioned that in their state, I think it was Texas, and we know Texas has some problematic state songs, right, that have been removed. The teacher was saying, well, the standards in Texas say, the music standards, that we have to teach, songs that represent Texas. So where am I supposed to find songs that represent Texas if all of them are harmful? I'm supposed to be removing all of them. Can I just still teach the song and just not go into the history? Can I just use it for the concepts? And so I kind of let other people talk first because I was just curious to see like what other folks would say. And then eventually the conversation was getting very unwieldy, not in a bad way, but just kind of like, I felt like the main thing that needed to be said was being skirted around. Like there was an elephant in the room and other folks were kind of jumping in, but they were not addressing the actual underpinnings of what this teacher was saying. And so I interrupted and I was like, let's actually talk about what's really underneath this. Let's not skirt around it, because that's further propagating the issues, right? And so as I was thinking about that, and then kind of not randomly, so I just released our newest service, the Responsive Music Educator Library, which is an asynchronous on-demand library of our professional development sessions, but in a more user-friendly format than when I released the library last year. And so that's available right now on my website. You can go check that out, ashleycuthbertson.com. I'm sure I have links all over the place. You can also find, as I was finishing it, because it released on the 1st, what was that, Tuesday? As I was finishing that up, over the weekend, like really getting all these videos edited, I was listening to myself talk a lot about cultural competence and bias, because that was what one of the workshops that's in there. One of the sections is about cultural competence development, addressing one's own biases, self-awareness, and things like that. So I was like listening to myself talk about this as I was editing those videos. And then very randomly, my husband had like traveled to go visit a friend of his and was coming back. So I went to the airport, which, by the way, I don't drive a whole lot anymore because I travel a lot, but I get driven often, or I take the train, or I get, I just get taken places, or my husband drives me, or somebody else. And so having to like drive to Reagan, I'm just outside of DC, so we go to Reagan usually. Having to like navigate the airport was a whole adventure. But anyway, so finally he gets his bags, I pick him up. We're talking about his flight experience. And he was just mentioning the person he was sitting next to, I think on he had a connecting flight. So it was like the last leg of his flight. And he was saying like, oh, it was like a big rancher dude. And my husband's also kind of like a wide, not super wide person, but like two wide dudes, like sitting next to each other, not in, a super spacious area. And I was like, oh, he was a rancher. Like, oh, did he like talk to you about his job as a rancher? And he was like, oh no, I don't actually know that he was a rancher. I just assumed because he kind of looked like he was. And I was like, what do you mean you assumed? Like, what did he say to you that like told you that he was a rancher? He just assumed it. So it was ironic that I literally had spent like days listening to myself talk about cultural competence and bias and self-awareness, not making assumptions about people. And then like twice in like 2 days, I had the experience at that summit where we talked about that example I just shared about that teacher, and I'll get back to that in a second. And then my husband like sharing his own bias about somebody looked a certain way. And so I was like, you know what, this week I want to come on and do a session to talk about what's really underneath the comments that people make, that we really need to understand, first of all, what's underneath what people are saying so that we can really partner especially with teachers, right? We want to partner with them to move them along on their journey, but we can't do that effectively if we don't understand like what is underneath what the comment is that they're saying. And so I first want to be very clear that, because I often steer away from the repertoire conversation because I feel like it's my responsibility as an authority of culturally responsive music education that I have to move my people away from just focusing on the repertoire conversation. What's underneath the reason why people feel so comfortable having the repertoire conversation is that when you think about the levels of culture, right? So there's like the concrete level, which is what things that you can see, feel, hear, teach. Music, depending upon how you're utilizing it, falls into this like surface culture. If you're thinking of like, I like the image of the apple tree. So like the fruit, like you could literally pluck the fruit off the tree. That's concrete surface culture. And then below that is behavioral. So that would be like the branches and the leaves of the tree. Then we're getting into like family structures, language, how it's used, nonverbal communication, and then deeper cultures, symbolic culture. That's where we get into a person's like deeply held values, what they believe. Worldview, religious views, and things like that are in that more symbolic level of culture. And so as somebody who, like, this is what I do to help music teachers to move past the surface level understanding of what culturally responsive music education is, how do you develop the skills, the knowledge, but also the disposition to be able to implement it effectively such that you're utilizing your students' cultural frames of reference to move them along as learners. I feel like it's important for me to not sit in the song conversation too long because I recognize that what's underneath the reason why people prefer to talk about song choice versus like bias and cultural competence and how those things appear in your instructional choices is because it's a lot easier, right? It's a lot easier to talk about surface culture things, which songs are essentially. It's a lot easier to talk about that than get to the real root of what's going on and to talk about the more difficult things like how your deeply held values and beliefs are being demonstrated in the choices that you're making instructionally, and how because of maybe your lack of self-awareness, you could be doing some unintentionally harmful things to your students. That's a much harder conversation to have than let me find a list of songs and tell me which ones don't use. And those of you who know me know I prefer not to even give guidance on like what songs to use, what's not, because it's not about the list. And there's lots of lists you can find, right? The list for wind band repertoire that you shouldn't be engaging with anymore, the list for orchestra, the list for choir, the list for general music. I mean, there are all these lists floating around. That can be another conversation for another day, my thoughts about the list. But the reality is like a list can't tell you what's going to be best for your students because a list doesn't know your kids, right? A list does not know your choir program or your band program. A list cannot make those decisions for you. You still have to do the hard work of understanding who are my students, what are their cultural frames of reference. So what's their prior knowledge and their experiences, their interests? How does that relate to me, their beliefs and their values? It's not just about what songs they want to sing and what kinds of activities they want to. It's not just about that, right? That's surface culture. The harder conversation is what are the values and the beliefs? How do my students communicate? How can I align my instructional choices in my music program to be congruent with those so that students are learning in the way that their brain already has sense of versus in a way where their brain feels lost in the sauce, right? So I want to first say, simply diversifying your repertoire is not actually culturally responsive, and that's not the conversation that we need to continue to have. I wish that we would stop having this repertoire conversation because it's just like a phantom for what really we need to be talking about, right? And I recognize that everybody's in a different place in their journey. And just like with our kids, we don't want to jump to the symbolic level of culture and immediately go to what's your deeply held belief, kid? We don't want to go there, right? We want to start at the surface. It's easier and less risky for students to share pieces of themselves at the surface level of culture. It's also easier for us as teachers to share our pieces of ourselves at the surface level as we're human beings getting to know them as well. And then we go deeper and deeper. And maybe another day we'll have a session about like, what could that look like? And the answer is it looks like the way your kids need it to look like, right? And so the bigger conversation and the more important one is not about repertoire. And I recognize that for some of us, some of you as leaders listening to this, that's where you might be. It also might be where your music teacher is. You got to start where they are, but we don't want to stay at the song choice conversation Our goal is to move along and move along, right? So I want to be clear about like that's not the be all end all. If you're just diversifying repertoire without any understanding of cultural competence, of systems, of society, then that's something else, right? We want to get beyond just that conversation. And it's important to know that when it comes to culturally responsive teaching, well, so I define culturally responsive music education as leveraging the prior knowledge, prior experiences, and prior interests of our students, that's their culture, right? To work in partnership with them, to be able to engage in relevant tasks in music making so that they can construct understandings about themselves, about others, and about the world around them. So it's not really about the repertoire, but the repertoire does serve as a vehicle for us to be able to construct these understandings, to make the instruction relevant and things like that. And so when we're considering the fact that it's really about the instructional choices that teachers make, that's what the conversation we need to center it around. It helps us to better frame our mind around what are we really hearing when a teacher is saying something like, well, why can't I just teach this song? I understand that I maybe shouldn't talk about the whole history of it, but like, what's wrong if I just don't talk about the history? Like, is it still a bad thing, right? Like, we have to understand why that teacher might be saying that. And I applaud music teachers and supervisors who are supporting them to shift their curriculum. I applaud the folks who are really doing the work of, I hate to say removing, because I think it's not about removing, it's about just centering better choices, right? In our instruction, in the songs that we're picking, repertoire, whether you teach high school band or elementary, general music, it's just about making better choices. So I tend not to use the term remove, because I don't think it's about removing things. I think it's about centering things that are better positioned to help your students construct those understandings I was talking about before. And there is so much music out there, right, at the same time. And so it's not like I removed it. Now what do I do? It's like, well, okay, you have so many other choices now that you can make. And so let me get back to the example I was giving of that teacher, right? And so when a teacher says something to me like, I remember having a conversation not that long ago with a band teacher where they were saying, well, this piece is a piece of music is a standard piece of wind band literature. Like, they need to know it. Even the teacher themselves even said, I know the composer has some issues. I know this piece itself is part of, they knew that. And I affirmed that, yeah, you're right. And the teacher still pushed back and said, well, this is standard repertoire. Like, I'm still going to teach it. Why wouldn't I? I think it's, you have to reframe your mindset. And collectively as a music field, we need to reframe our mindset, right? Thank you for that comment. Feel free to comment throughout this, folks. This is a session. I'd love for it to be a two-way conversation. So thank you for engaging. And when a teacher says things to me like, it's a standard piece of repertoire, we've always done it this way. First of all, that's a red flag to me when people say, we've always done it this way, like, uh-oh. And especially in the last 5 or so years, like I said, where I feel like this conversation about repertoire and removing and harmful, problematic things has been more brought to the forefront. I think also we need to remember, especially, I remember those early Facebook group days where it was like hot in those Facebook groups, right? I remember many, many teachers would say things in the group itself, or even conversations that I've had of my travels all around. A lot of music teachers felt really shut down in those conversations. They felt shut down because they felt like their questions were met with hostility. And they also felt shut down because they felt like the things that they had always been doing being now like revealed that maybe what they are doing is not helpful. So they just felt in general shut down. Now let me be clear. We do want to shut down conversations that are like deeply racist, deeply sexist, deeply ableist. Like, there's no place for that. So yes, we do want to shut those conversations down. And we also have to remember at the end of the day, that teacher has to go in a classroom and teach kids. So if in a conversation we are interacting with the teacher in such a way that now they feel so shut down that they don't want to engage any further in the conversation, and they're not feeling compelled to either seek out other ways to be more knowledgeable, they're still going into their classroom and teaching kids. And now they're going into their classroom and they're digging their heels in on the things that we know are harmful because they feel so shut down. So I think sometimes I feel like we forget that the internet is not really reality. And so just because the conversation has like kind of died down a little bit in like those Facebook groups, a little bit in the the broader internet street kind of conversation. The reason why is because those teachers are still feeling shut down, but now they're not being vocal about it. They're just quietly in their classrooms teaching the same old terrible, problematic, racist, sexist, ableist songs. But now they're clear that they don't want to engage in a possibility of something different, right? And so I think it's important to remember that our students suffer when we can't engage all of our colleagues in the conversation. And so the question is like, how do we address this without teachers feeling so shut down that they just fully disengage and then they want to dig in their heels further? And so, yeah, you're right. And now they're angry about it. And so not only are they like feeling shut down, they're feeling disvalued, they're angry, and now they're going to double down on teaching the things that they're not good for our kids, right? And that's not what we want for anybody. So we have to find a way to engage all of our colleagues in the conversation and respect and honor wherever people are on their journey. And it can be really uncomfortable, especially if you feel like you're a very self-aware leader, you feel like you've got a good handle on things, but now you're working with the teacher in your school or in your school district who is struggling at the beginning of their journey. Like, we have to remember that just like with kids, right? If we don't honor where that kid is in their journey right now, they're never going to be able to move forward, and they're never going to feel safe to be honest with us, to ask the questions that need to be asked for them to move forward. Same thing with teachers. And so my approach working with teachers, and first of all, I should say that in my framework, people often come to me. I just got a request this morning about PD for this fall. Folks often come to me because unfortunately, closely responsive teaching and music education is trendy right now. So oftentimes I get random requests from somebody, and I'm happy to hear the request and happy to explore what it would look like for me to work with their teachers. But unfortunately, because closely responsive teaching and diversity and music education, it's all very trendy right now. And so people want to check the box that, oh, somebody came and worked with us. Ashley came and worked with us. We got it. We're culturally responsive. Okay, no. And then the other thing is that people come to me saying, well, we're good on the repertoire. We already understand that we need to have diverse repertoire. Again, that's not culturally responsive, but we know we got to have diverse repertoire. We just want to help. We want help with like the implementation. And sometimes when people come to me and I explore further, I'm like, oh yeah, they've had a lot of the other work that needs to happen before we get to the instruction. And then other times people are just diversifying repertoire and like, actually, we got to go to the beginning. So when I first work with folks, we don't actually start at repertoire. We don't start at how do you write a lesson plan? How do you design your concert program? We have to actually start with how do you develop a mindset for equity that focuses on cultural competence and self-awareness? That's where we have to start, because I can give you lots of repertoire suggestions for all kinds of different disciplines. I taught band, I taught show music, I taught choir. I can give you lots of suggestions, right? I can give you lots of strategies for instruction and unit planning and lesson planning and how do you design a rehearsal that's learner-centered. I can do all of that, but here's the truth. Just like I was saying before, if you don't fundamentally have the mindset shift change, if you're feeling so shut down that you don't want to engage in the real conversation, it doesn't matter what strategy I give you. So that's actually where we have to start. And the hard truth is that not everybody wants to engage in that. And so often I have to turn down those inquiries because it's important to me that I don't play into the trendiness of culturally responsive music education. I prefer to work with folks that really want to do the work, which means that we have to start from how do we shift our mindset and our understandings around, first of all, understanding who we are so that we know what biases we're bringing into our music programs. And then how do we work with our kids to understand their frames of reference so that we can make instructional decisions accordingly? That's really what culturally responsive teaching is. So we have to be able to partner with our teachers and our school districts, or if you're a principal, we got to be able to work with our teachers in our schools to partner with them where they are. And oftentimes it means that we have to start from the literal beginning of, we have to uncover like an onion, right? Peel back the layers of who are you and why are you making the choices that you're making? Because everything that you're doing, what you think, what you believe, how you behave, how you communicate, all of it is a reflection of your beliefs and your values. The question is, do you understand what your beliefs and values are and why you may be motivated to make the choices that you're making, right? I'm not just talking about repertoire, right? Just walking around the street. Why are you going to that restaurant versus another, right? There's something underneath that. So back to the main conversation. I went off a little bit on a tangent there. Back to the main conversation. So when I hear that, yeah, identity first, definitely, Angelica. So when I hear a teacher say something like, well, this is what we've always done, or if I just don't talk about the full history, why is that bad? I'm not going to talk about the racist part. I'm just going to use it to teach this technique or this concept or, whatever. What I really hear is fear. And we'll talk about this a little bit last week of the fear that pops up when teachers are confronted with changing their practices, right? So what I hear first of all is I hear that there's some kind of fear that's happening, but I don't want to assume what the fear may be. So let's ask some curious questions. Okay, so for instance, with this particular teacher at the summit, questions. I forget what the first question was that I asked her. But I asked her first a couple of curious questions, and then I kind of did prophesize a little bit because I was a little bit like everybody else has said all of the other things except for the main thing, which is the first thing I said to her was, at the end of the day, we teach kids. It's not about the repertoire that we're teaching. It's about the kids that we teach, and the repertoire helps us. That's our content area. But like, first of all, we teach kids. So just like a doctor, do no harm. As teachers, we need to not be doing harm. Now, I say that as somebody who has made mistakes and has had to make apologies and make things right because I'm a human being. And at the end of the day, if we lose sight of the fact that we teach kids first and the repertoire choices are just a vehicle for how we help them make those understandings about themselves, about others and the world around them, and develop the skills that are going to be useful regardless of if they're in music or not. If we lose sight of that, which is what nobody wanted to say, right? If we lose sight of that, then we've kind of failed at our job, right? And I think what's underneath those questions is fear, but also a lack of self-awareness. So the teacher was saying, well, what am I going to teach for this standard that says I have to teach songs about the state? First of all, there's plenty of other music. So I'm hearing a fear and I'm hearing a bias there of you're afraid that having to find other things will disvalue maybe what you have already done. And it's uncomfortable to learn that you've been making some poor choices, right? So I'm hearing the fear about that. I'm also hearing the bias about that. But really what is underneath that, I feel like not enough people want to confront because it's hard, especially when you're working with somebody who has kind of dug in their heels a little bit. What I really hear when teachers say things like, well, we've always done it this way, it's the tradition, what else am I going to teach? What I really hear is their privilege. In their seat, they're privileged enough to be able to walk around in the world and not have to think about the fact that people created music for the specific explicit purpose of harming other people, of denigrating other people, right? In your privilege, you're able to walk around the world and not think about like, oh yeah, people wrote music specifically to, I mean, that's what blackface minstrelsy music was. It was created to denigrate Black folks. We cannot get around that fact. That's what it was. And so, and she was not talking about a blackface minstrelsy song, but just as an example, right? And so what I hear underneath that is an unawareness of one's own privilege and an unawareness of how your privilege and biases around your privilege are showing up in the choices that you're making in your music classroom. Thank you, Angelica. And so I think the real conversation that we need to have is how do we partner with teachers and forget about the teacher's race or whatever kind of identity that they're identifying with, but how do we best partner with our music teachers as leaders to help them, first of all, uncover their own self-awareness and their own biases so that we can understand who we are. And then how do we help them when they discover, because it can be uncomfortable to discover like, yeah, I have privilege in this way. And all of us have some sort of privilege in some kind of pocket of our own identity, right? But it's others of us have more identities that privilege more than others. And so what I was hearing from this teacher, who was a white female presenting teacher, I should say, although I think she did say her pronouns were she, her. What I was hearing was a total lack of awareness of their own privilege and a total lack of awareness of how her privilege and her biases around her privilege are showing up in her instructional choices. Because she was, first of all, she was totally open to the conversation. And before I kind of like laid out all of the things to her, I started first with like, thank you for bringing up this conversation, because clearly this is something that was on your mind. And I know it was on other people's minds, because whenever I do that talk, the conversation always comes to something of this degree because of what I said before, because it's so much easier to talk about song repertoire choices than to talk about cultural competence, equity, privilege. It's so much easier to have the song conversation because it's surface culture, right? And so I, first of all, said, thank you for bringing this conversation, and thank you for like being vulnerable enough in this space. You know, we didn't know each other. So like, thank you for being vulnerable enough in this space because you're not the only one, I'm sure, that has these questions. And it's my responsibility as a leader in this field to not let anybody off the hook when I experience somebody who I clearly see like it's a matter of not understanding self-awareness, not understanding privilege, because she was kind of making the argument that, well, if I just don't teach all of the parts of the history and I just focus on the concept, well, music was not created to teach concepts. Well, some like a flute exercise might be created to teach a particular concept, but most music is not most, all music, except for ones that are contrived and composed for a very explicit, like I'm a beginner flute player, I was a flute player, beginning flute player method book. Music is created to reflect self-identity and culture and society at large. So most of us are not sitting around composing an orchestra piece thinking I really need my violins to learn how to tremolo. Like that's not what they're creating that for, right? And so when we pick repertoire specifically and then argue that, well, if I just don't teach the full history of it, I'm only focusing on this particular concept or technique. First of all, you're erasing history and you're erasing other people's identity, but also you're not really teaching music, right? Because music is not just about the concept and techniques. And my approach to culture of music education is we always start with the why first. Why would somebody want to learn this? Why would somebody want to interact with it? And in the real world, how do people interact with it? And then we back into skills and concepts and techniques. But when we start with the skills and concepts and techniques first, then we fall into this easy surface culture kind of trap of, oh, well, I'm not going to share the fact that this composer was like a really like terrible human being, abusive, because I'm just teaching how to trill on the flute. That's problematic, right? And so I think the conversation as leaders in our schools, leaders in our school districts that we need to be having with our music teams, our music colleagues, I know as music teachers here, what we have to be able to do is to understand what is underneath that. And when you hear somebody who is so focused on the song choice, but is unwilling to go deeper, that is a clue to you that you need to really help that teacher to kind of walk back. And we have to do it with sensitivity, because like I said, at the end of the day, that teacher is still going in the classroom and teaching kids. We don't want them going back feeling shut down and angry and with their heels dug in. We want them going back feeling like, okay, I learned something. It was hard for me to hear, but like I'm open and I have somebody that can walk with me, not against me, but with me and help me to navigate this journey. That's how we want teachers to go back in their classrooms. We don't want them feeling so shut down that they don't engage, because they're just quietly like harming kids. And we don't want that, right? So we have to really consider that fact, and the conversation that we need to be having is at that level. We've got to stop just having this surface song culture kind of conversation, because all repertoire choices are going to reveal some kind of bias, but are they revealing and values and beliefs, but are they revealing like helpful bias? Because sometimes bias can be helpful, right? Bias is just like the shortcut your brain makes to make sense of all the pieces of information, right? So can we make sure that the choices that we're making are reflecting positive values, positive beliefs? Maybe I shouldn't say positive bias, but positive values and positive beliefs, versus we're making choices and we don't even understand what we're doing, and now we're unintentionally harming. Yeah, Angelica, we have to help teachers feel more empowered, because the reality is the teacher is the first line of defense. So as leaders, as principals and fine arts supervisors, district supervisors, like we're not the ones that are going to be in the classroom necessarily with that teacher. So they need to be empowered enough to like make good choices and want to engage in the conversation. And 233 music teacher, I see you on Instagram. First of all, thank you for being fine to learn from your mistakes. That's the first step, right? You have to be willing to say, I messed up, and what are we going to learn? And then, it can be really difficult to know, well, how do I make a better song choice? One thing I think that, because music teachers are so used to working alone in silos, like sometimes we're the only music teacher in the school, or maybe there are other music teachers, but like one teaches choir, one teaches band, one teaches guitar, right? So it's still like we're a little bit on our own. We're used to problem solving by ourselves in silos, but we need to be more of a community to help each other, because the reality is so many of us are doing great work, but not enough of us are connected and plugged in. And so when we work in community, and I think one of my, in July, I did that series of 30 videos. One of them talked about you have to be plugged into other people, because trying to walk this road by yourself, it's going to be easy to fall back on, old habits because it's going to get hard. And also you don't have any sort of accountability, right? And so when the going gets tough, it can be easier to just keep doing the easy thing because, like I said, music teachers already have so much on our plates, right? But we need to be plugged into community so that for your future song choices, you can make more solid decisions. But it all begins with us as leaders who are working and supporting music teachers. How can we hear what's underneath what they are saying and then coach them through that to be able to really help shift the mindset? Because at the end of the day, if they're just picking songs off of a list that says these are songs that are not problematic, so we should pick these and others, well, then what do they do when they're confronted with a piece of music that could be perfectly fine for their classroom, but it's not on a list, right? Like, how do we help them to have the skills, not just the knowledge, but the skills to make good choices, right? So we have to empower our teachers. We can't leave people feeling so shut down that they don't engage in the conversation. Yes, and so that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. I went a little bit off on a tangent there in the middle, so I meant for this just to be a quick session, but I really felt pulled from having so many like things happen over the last few days of like, yeah, this is a conversation, this is a session that I want to make sure I bring to my folks. So I hope this was valuable to you. I'm going to hang on for another couple of questions that you may have. So go ahead and drop your questions in the chat while I'm wrapping up. I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear your experiences as well. Some of you are teachers, some of you are principals. I see a couple of fine arts supervisors across all the places where I am. So let me know your experiences. What has it been like for you when you hear music teachers say some of those things that I shared? How have you partnered with them to help them move past the surface to really get to like, what is the underlying fear that they have? What is the underlying belief? Like, I'd love to hear that as well. All right, I see Sally. Oh, Sally, what is Texas PML? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know what Texas PML is. Is that a association? I'm not familiar with that. So let me know. I think my teacher was in Texas someplace. So let me know your question. Okay, so while we're kind of wrapping up, so like I shared before, I'm a former pre-K through 12 music educator and college professor. And now I own my own educational consulting company. And so I work with, I partner really with schools, districts, and organizations to serve their music teachers all throughout the country. Next week, I'll be in Kentucky. I'm so excited. I don't think I've ever been to Kentucky. Actually, maybe I've driven through, but I'll be in Kentucky to serve music teachers in Fayette County. I'm so excited to be with them for the day. I'm actually going to be with them for the full day. So I'm doing a keynote for all of their visual and performing arts teachers. So music, art. I feel like maybe there was dance and theater in there too. So I'm excited to speak in the larger sense of the arts. And then I'm going to work in some breakout sessions with their music teachers. I'm so excited to get to work with them. And then I'll be in Pittsburgh for the State of Black Learning Conference. I'm excited to meet some of my educational consultant friends that I've been connected to over the last year, to get to meet them in person and to meet some good folks who are doing good work in terms of how do we look at the state of Black learning and how do we keep the conversation moving forward. So I work with teachers all over the place, and I'm always looking for additional partnerships. So I'm in conversations right now with several great folks. And if what I said today resonates with you, if you've been following me for a while and you're curious, like what would it be like for me to bring my services to work with your school, your district, your organization, I'd love to have a conversation. So send me a DM and we can just start that conversation of what that will look like. I'll tell you just a little bit about it. So like I shared before, I created a framework for culturally responsive music education. So that is all that I do. There was a time where I also would support folks with like differentiation and universal design for learning. I still do that, but it's under the umbrella of the bigger work that I do because it's just one part. So that if you're asked like, what is it that you present on? I help music educators develop the skills, knowledge, dispositions to deliver culturally responsive music education. That's what I do. And my primary services are professional learning. And so still a teacher at heart. That's what I do primarily. And so I have my introductory workshop, which I always suggest to folks. That's the best place to start, because I think for music educators, because we have so few examples of what does it even look like to do this. Oh yeah, Oodles of Music. Yeah, feel free to catch the replay. I'll make sure I post this on my channel. So feel free to come back, and thank you for jumping in. So I always suggest to folks to start with that introductory workshop because it's the overview of my entire framework approach. And then we also do some like actual live demonstrations so that teachers can really see like in practice, what does it look like? There's so much theory out there, but not enough practical stuff. So that first, it's a half-day introductory workshop. I take folks through my story of how I came to the framework in the first place, sharing the mistakes and bruises, all with the successes as well. But I share how I came to the framework. And it's important that I share that story because it's how I know that it works. I know that it works for me and the numerous communities that I taught in, but I also know that it works for the teachers that I've supported. So I share that story along with some stories of other teachers that I've worked with, because I think it's important to know that I am not just theorizing when I say the things. I know because I know that I know. I've done it for myself. I've done it for other teachers. So that introductory workshop, I take you through my story, how I created the framework, and then I take you through at a very high level of how do we develop cultural competence in the musical sense. And part of us understanding as music educators, both the cultural competence piece, but also the equity pieces, we have to understand our common music program policies, practices, and procedures, how many of them are rooted in inequity and inaccessibility. We have to understand some of those historical things as we shift our mindset. So I have a very high overview of that. We'll look at learning environment, repertoire choice, of course, and then also instructional moves as well. That's the introductory workshop. It's a half day. It is a 4-figure investment. So I will say that. And then beyond that, for folks who are really ready to do the work, like I said, I get requests all the time from people who just want to check the box. We worked with Ashley. We did culturally responsive teaching. Yay, us. Okay, no, the introduction is just the introduction, right? That's how I make sure that my teachers know where we're going first. Still as a good teacher, right? You got to know where you're going to back up and work through the journey. So beyond that, then we look at what are your district or your school's priorities. And so my framework has 4 sections, and each section has its own series of workshops that are, I suggest 3 workshops after we've done the introductory one. So 4 total, could be all in 1 year, could be, intro 1 year, the workshop series next year, or, whatever works for your schedule. And then we look at where best does the framework align with your current district priorities. So often the priority might be like creating responsive learning environments, cultivating a sense of belonging. So then we look at the learning environment series. So I partner with you to figure out like what makes the most sense for where your teachers, where your school district priorities are, and how can I best support that. Always connected to instruction, because at the end of the day, we got to go in the classroom and teach. So even though we might focus on the learning environment pieces, it's always learning environment, and then how does that translate into instruction? And so that's the main service that I provide. And then for folks who are ready for more intensive support, my year-long responsive music educator lab PD program is the full framework, like workshops and things, plus other resources that I've created, along with instructional coaching. Because just having, workshops is nice, but what I've learned, especially this last year, is that if I leave you and then don't come back for like, a couple months, you're going to get stuck. So it includes both a combination of like group coaching plus one-on-one coaching as well. So that is also, that's a 5-figure investment, I'll say, for that more high-level program. So if you're interested in that, just send me a DM. Let's talk about what that could look like. Those are the main services that I provide, but I also do some curriculum development on the side from time to time, as well as just general music program evaluation and assessment. So if that's something that you're also interested in, let's send me a DM. Let's have a conversation about what that could look like to support your music teachers at your school if you're a principal, or your music educators at your district if you are a district administrator as well. I'm still looking for some additional partnerships for the year. And so if you're interested at all, let me know, because the sooner we can start the conversation, even if it doesn't make sense like right today, right now, I know that it's like, beginning of the school year, it's crazy. Maybe we look at it in the spring. The sooner that we can have the conversation going, I can make sure I have space for you on my calendar amongst all the other things that I'm doing. And then if you're a music teacher, I know some of you are independent music teachers that are just looking for support for yourself. The Responsive Music Educator Library is my answer for you. And so I also do district bulk orders. I just did one today, actually. Just closed that. And then I also have individual teachers can buy it. So if you go to my website, ashleycuthbertson.com, at the top it says, or I hope it says, the Responsive Music Educator Library. I think it does. Yeah, so at the very top, you'll be able to see what's currently in the library. Right now, we have just a small selection as we're working through re-putting all the other ones up, but we'll be adding new ones each month for you to be able to go through asynchronously at your own pace. That is, right now, it's $375 for the year. So you subscribe for the year, you get all the access to what's in there, Plus, when I add additional things, you'll be able to access all of that, and you can pay for that yourself. Yeah, I also always suggest, like, your school has PD funds, so ask your principal what kind of PD funds are available, and how can you tap into them. Every school has PD funds. Make sure that you're aware and you're talking to your principal about what that could be. I can do purchase orders for that as well. So let me see if I had other questions. Oh, hey, squad. I see Aaron and Kanika. Hey. Let me see what other questions we have. Oh, Sally is saying that what was the question? I asked Sally, what is the Texas PMAL? And Sally said it's the choose music from, it's for the UIL competitions. It's the list, the Texas list. Yes. Yeah, Sally, let me know if you want me to hook in and help some folks make some choices about the Texas PML list. Connect me to whoever would be the one I would need to talk to about that. I'd love to have a conversation about what that could look like to help support them. And then I see Julie is asking, is there a way to make a donation towards your work? Julie, do you mean like in terms of the member? Are you asking about the subscription to the Responsive Music Educator Library? It's not a membership because I don't do, you don't get me live, basically. It's all the asynchronous PD that I've done over this past year that we're just putting into this format. So let me know if you're asking about that or something else. But for the Responsive Music Educator Library, it is the $375. That's the cost for one seat. And then if you want more than one seat, then it's $375 times however many seats that you want. And I do have packages for school districts. So let me know if you want to talk about the package for the library, because I do offer both the library plus other things along with that as well. And then Angelica, that's good. Thank you. Or Angelica. Let me know, Angelica, because I've seen that name both spelt that way, but then pronounced multiple ways. So let me know if I'm saying Angelica or Angelica, because I want to make sure I'm saying your name correctly. All right. Well, this was a deep, meaty session. I thought I was going to come on and talk for just like 30 minutes, but here we've been on for almost an hour. I'm going to pause for like 10 more seconds for questions. I know that there's a delay. So let me know right now if you have any questions, because I do have a session I need to pop on to. But thank you for joining, whether you're here live or if you are catching the replay. And again, I want this to be a two-way conversation. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know your experiences. And if you're looking for support, if you're a principal, if you're a school district leader, I'm taking partnerships right now. So send me a DM. Let's get the conversation started about how we can support your music educators to not just make surface level decisions, but really make the mindset shifts necessary for culturally responsive teaching. Oh, Julie is saying, can't afford the subscription, but want to donate. I don't take donations for the subscription, Julie. But like I said, Julie, I'm not sure if you're a teacher or not, but if you're a teacher at a school, public schools for sure, I know they have PD budgets. So not get connected to your principal. Talk to your principal and find out what is available to you, and then get back to me. And I see that you're on YouTube. Find me either on my website. You can send a contact message. I don't think on YouTube you can send a DM, or find me on Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn and send me a DM. But your school, if you're a public school teacher, they have PD funds. I don't take donations, but find out with your principal what could be available to you. All right. I don't see any other additional questions. So thank you for hanging with me. I'll probably will not be on next week for a lunch and learn, because I have a full week of PD facilitating that I'm doing and conference presenting. So I probably will not pop on, but I'll pop on maybe the week after that. If I can find a spare minute, maybe I'll pop on and share what's going on as I'm facilitating and presenting next week. So thank you for hanging with me, and I will see you again at our next session. All right, bye.